A polar bear, the symbol of the ice and snow-swathed far north. But increasingly a military deployment can be seen as common a sight as the great white bear. Here's a Russian military camp high above the Arctic Circle, filmed by a US military plane. Military activity in the Arctic is increasing. But why? I'm meeting with Dr. Duncan-De, who explains there are two main reasons. The first is environmental. Permanent ice cover giving way, down around 13% in the summer over the last decade.
Without ice, it's more access for shipping, and so countries like Canada and Russia, and even Denmark, because Greenland is still part of Denmark, they're thinking, well, if there's going to be less ice around our coastlines, then how are we going to make sure that we prevent sort of illegal activity? How are we going to demonstrate that these areas belong to our national territory and that we are the authority over these areas?
And the reason they want to defend them is because of what's there. Vast riches by the way of mineral deposits and the commercial possibility of shipping lines opening up in the high north. So how are they defending their newly accessible borders?
Canada, for example, is really focusing on developing quite small but highly mobile units that can quickly move around and be first responders in a crisis, whereas Russia, which has a far more accessible coastline because of the prevailing environmental conditions, they are having to basically think about how they're going to protect the entire length of their 22,000 kilometre coastline. I mean, it's a huge distance that they have to defend, and so they're reopening bases that they had during the Cold War. They're upgrading their ships.
The second reason for increased military activity is strategic. Tensions rising between Russia and NATO. The vast wide areas above the US and Russia need at least some form of visible protection, just like during the Cold War. But how does Britain stand on all this? Certain units most definitely do train for Arctic deployments. Royal Marines here in 2013. UK submarines patrol and air assets can most certainly be used. But 2015's SDSR made little reference to a militarised Arctic, and a subgrouping of the Defence Committee are investigating whether more should be done. Perhaps a return to a time when army units operated in the Arctic, as former paratrooper Tim Riles remembers from his deployment there in the early 1980s.
We worked with the Marines in the Arctic. We were trained initially by them, and then there was a separation of their operations and our operations. So it was really, the premise really was, first of all, was survival. It was actually teaching young soldiers just how to survive in anything from -10 down to -50 or 60 that we actually were still operating in. And then secondly, it was essentially at that time, it was protection of NATO's northern flank. With Norway there and Russia next door and coming through the Iceland Gap and things like that.
If sea ice continues to diminish at its current rate, interest will continue to grow in the Arctic. Many feel Britain must now decide whether it will become a significant part of this or if it's a job for others. Tim Cooper, Forces News.